Hello, and welcome to Bookspot. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time, we will continue our reading of The City and the Stars by Arthur C. Clarke. Our protagonist, Alvin, and his friend Hilvar have left Earth in the last spaceship known to history. They were very high when Alvin gave the robot its final instructions. The ship had come to rest, and the Earth was perhaps 1,000 miles below, nearly filling the sky. It looked very uninviting. Alvin wondered how many ships in the past had hovered here for a little while and then continued on their way. There was an appreciable pause, as if the robot was checking controls and circuits that had not been used for geological ages. Then came a very faint sound, the first that Alvin had ever heard from a machine. It was a tiny humming, which soared swiftly octave by octave until it was lost at the edge of hearing. There was no sense of change or motion, but suddenly he noticed that the stars were drifting across the screen. The Earth reappeared and rolled past, then appeared again in a slightly different position. The ship was hunting, swinging in space like a compass needle seeking the north. For minutes the skies turned and twisted around them until at last the ship came to rest, a gigantic projectile aimed at the stars. Centered in the screen, the great ring of 7 suns lay in its rainbow-hued beauty. A little of Earth was still visible at a dark crescent edged with gold and crimson of the sunset. Something was happening now, Alvin knew, beyond all his experience. He waited, gripped his seat, while the seconds drifted by and the 7 suns glittered on the screen. There was no sound, only a sudden wrench that seemed to blur the vision. But Earth had vanished, as if a giant hand had whipped it away. They were alone in space, alone with the stars and a strangely shrunken sun. Earth was gone as though it had never been. Again came the wrench, and with it now the faintest murmur of sound, as if for the first time the generators were exerting some appreciable fraction of their power. Yet for a moment it seemed that nothing had happened, that Alvin realized that the sun itself was gone, and the stars were creeping slowly past the ship. He looked back for an instant and saw nothing. All the heavens behind had vanished utterly, obliterated by a hemisphere of night. Even as he watched, he could see the stars plunge into it, to disappear like sparks falling upon water. The ship was traveling far faster than light, and Alvin knew that the familiar space of Earth and sun held him no more. When that sudden vertiginous wrench came for the 3rd time, his heart almost stopped beating. The strange blurring of vision was unmistakable now. For a moment his surroundings seemed distorted out of recognition. The meaning of that distortion came to him in a flash of insight he could not explain. It was real, and no delusion of the eyes. Somehow he was catching, as he passed through the thin film of the present, a glimpse of the changes that were occurring in the space around him. At the same instant, the murmur of the generators rose to a roar that shook the ship, a sound doubly impressive, for it was the first cry of protest that Alvin had ever heard from a machine. Then it was all over, and the sudden silence seemed to ring in his ears. The great generators had done their work. They would not be needed again until the end of the voyage. The stars ahead flared blue-white and vanished into the ultraviolet. Yet, by some magic of science or nature, the 7 suns were still visible, though now their positions and colors were subtly changed. The ship was hurtling toward them along a tunnel of darkness, beyond the boundaries of space and time, at a velocity too enormous for the mind to contemplate. It was hard to believe that they had now been flung out of the solar system at a speed which, unless it were checked, would soon take them through the heart of the galaxy and into the greater emptiness beyond. Neither Alvin nor Hilvar could conceive the real immensity of their journey. The great sagas of exploration had completely changed men's outlook toward the universe, and even now, millions of centuries later, the ancient traditions had not wholly died. There had once been a ship, legend whispered, that had circumnavigated the cosmos between the rising and setting of the sun. The billions of miles between stars meant nothing before such speeds. To Alvin, this voyage was very little greater and perhaps less dangerous than his first journey to Lys. It was Hilvar who voiced both their thoughts as the seven suns slowly brightened ahead. "Alvin," he remarked, "that formation can't possibly be natural." The other nodded. "I've thought that for many years, but it still seems fantastic." "The system may not have been built by man," agreed Hilvar, "but intelligence must have created it. Nature could never have formed that perfect circle of stars, all equally brilliant, and there's nothing else in the visible universe like the central sun." "Why should such a thing have been made, then?" "Oh, I can think of many reasons. Perhaps it's a signal so that any strange ship entering our universe will know where to look for life. Perhaps it marks the center of galactic administration. Or perhaps, and somehow I feel that this is the real explanation, it's simply the greatest of all works of art. But it's foolish to speculate now. In a few hours we shall know the truth." We shall know the truth. Perhaps, thought Alvin, but how much of it shall we ever know? It seemed strange that now, while he was leaving Diaspar and indeed Earth itself at a speed beyond all comprehension, his mind should turn once more to the mystery of his origin. Yet perhaps it was not so surprising. He had learned many things since he had first arrived in Lys, but until now he had had not a single moment for quiet reflection. There was nothing he could do now but sit and wait. His immediate future was controlled by the wonderful machine, surely one of the supreme engineering achievements of all time, that was now carrying him into the heart of the universe. Now was the moment for thought and reflection, whether he wished it or not. But first he would tell Hilvar all that had happened to him since their hasty parting only 2 days before. Hilvar absorbed the tale without comment, and without asking for an explanation he seemed to understand at once everything that Alvin had described, and showed no signs of surprise even when he heard of the meeting with the central computer and the operation it had performed upon the robot's mind. It was not that he was incapable of wonder, but that the history of the past was full of marvels that could match anything in Alvin's story. "It's obvious," he said when Alvin had finished talking, "that the central computer must have received special instructions regarding you when it was built. By now, you must have guessed why." "I think so. Kedron gave me part of the answer when he explained how the men who designed Diaspar had taken steps to prevent it becoming decadent." "Do you think you and the other uniques before you are part of the social mechanism which prevents complete stagnation? So that whereas the jesters are short-term correcting factors, you and your kind are long-term ones?" Hilvar had expressed the idea better than Alvin could, yet this was not exactly what he had in mind. "I believe the truth is more complicated than that. It almost looks as if there was a conflict of opinion when the city was built, between those who wanted it shut off completely from the outside world and those who wanted to maintain some contacts. The first faction won, but the others did not admit defeat. I think Yarlan Zay must have been one of their leaders, but he was not powerful enough to act openly. He did his best by leaving the subway in existence and by ensuring that at long intervals someone would come out of the Hall of Creation who did not share the fears of all his fellow men. In fact, I wonder—" Alvin paused, and his eyes veiled with thought, so that for a moment he seemed oblivious of his surroundings. "What are you thinking now?" asked Hilvar. "It just occurred to me. Perhaps I am Yarlan Zay. It's perfectly possible. He may have fed his personality into the memory banks, relying on it to break the mold of Diaspar before it was too firmly established. One day I must discover what happened to the earlier uniques. That may help to fill in the gaps in the picture." And Yarlan Zay, or whoever it was, also instructed the central computer to give special assistance to the uniques whenever they were created, mused Hilvar, following up this line of logic. "That's right. The ironic thing is that I could have got all the information I needed direct from the central computer without any assistance from poor Kedron. It would have told me more than it ever told him, but there's no doubt that he saved me a good deal of time and taught me much that I could never have learned by myself. I think your theory covers all the known facts, said Hilvar cautiously. Unfortunately, it still leaves wide open the biggest problem of all, the original purpose of Diaspar. Why did your people try to pretend the outer world didn't exist? That's a question I'd like to see answered. It's a question I intend to answer, replied Alvin, but I don't know when or how. So they argued and dreamed while hour by hour the seven suns drifted apart until they had filled that strange tunnel of night in which the ship was riding. Then, one by one, the 6 outer stars vanished at the brink of darkness, and at last only the central sun was left. Though it could no longer be fully in their space, it still shone with the pearly light that marked it out from all the other stars. Minute by minute, its brilliance increased until presently it was no longer a point but a tiny disk. And now the disk was beginning to expand before them. There was the briefest of warnings. For a moment, a deep bell-like note vibrated through the room. Alvin clenched the arms of his chair, though it was a futile enough gesture. Once again, the great generators exploded into life, and with an abruptness that was almost blinding, the stars reappeared. The ship had dropped back into space, back into the universe of suns and planets, the natural world where nothing could move more swiftly than light. They were already within the system of the 7 suns, for the great ring of colored globes now dominated the sky. And what a sky it was! All the stars they had known, all the familiar constellations, had gone. The Milky Way was no longer a faint band of mist far to one side of the heaven. They were now at the center of creation, and its great circle divided the universe in twain. The ship was still moving very swiftly toward the central sun, and the 6 remaining stars of the system were colored beacons ranged around the sky. Not far from the nearest of them were the tiny sparks of circling planets, worlds that must have been enormous to be visible over such a distance. The cause of the central sun's nacreous light was now clearly visible. The great star was shrouded in an envelope of gas which softened its radiation and gave it its characteristic color. The surrounding nebula could only be seen indirectly, and it was twisted into strange shapes that eluded the eye. But there it was, and the longer one stared, the more extensive it seemed to be. "Well, Alvin," said Hilvar, "we have a good many worlds to take our choice from, or do you hope to explore them all?" "It's lucky that won't be necessary," admitted Alvin. "If we can make contact anywhere, we'll get the information we need. The logical thing would be to head for the largest planet of the central sun. Unless it's too large. Some planets, I've heard, were so big that human life could not exist on them. Men would be crushed under their own weight. I doubt if that will be true here, since I'm sure this system is entirely artificial. In any case, we'll be able to see from space whether there are any cities and buildings." Hilvar pointed to the robot. "Our problem has been solved for us. Don't forget our guide has been here before. He's taking us home, and I wonder what he thinks about it." That was something that Alvin had also wondered. But was it accurate? Did it make any sense at all to imagine that the robot felt anything resembling human emotions now that it was returning to the ancient home of the Master after so many eons? In all his dealings with it, since the central computer had released the blocks which made it mute, the robot had never shown any signs of feeling or emotion. It had answered his questions and obeyed his commands, but its real personality had proved utterly inaccessible to him. That it had a personality, Alvin was sure. Otherwise, he would not have felt that obscure sense of guilt which afflicted him when he recalled the trick he had played upon it, and upon its now dormant companion. It still believed in everything that the Master had taught it, Though it had seen him fake miracles and tell lies to his followers, these inconvenient facts did not affect its loyalty. It was able, like many humans before it, to reconcile two conflicting sets of data. Now it was following its immemorial memories back to their origin. Almost lost in the glare of the central sun was a pale spark of light, with around it the fainter gleams of yet smaller worlds. Their enormous journey was coming to its end. In a little while, they would know if it had been in vain. Chapter 20. The planet they were approaching now was only a few million miles away, a beautiful sphere of multicolored light. There could be no darkness anywhere upon its surface, for as it turned beneath the central sun, the other stars would march one by one across its skies. Alvin now saw very clearly the meaning of the Master's dying words. It is lovely to watch the colored shadows on the planets of eternal light. Now they were so close that they could see continents and oceans in a faint haze of atmosphere. Yet there was something puzzling about its markings, and presently they realized that the divisions between land and water were curiously regular. This planet's continents were not as nature had left them. But how small a task the shaping of a world must have been to those who built its suns. "Those aren't oceans at all," Hilvar exclaimed suddenly. "Look, you can see markings in them." Not until the planet was nearer could Alvin see clearly what his friend meant. Then he noticed faint bands and lines along the continental borders, well inside what he had taken to be the limits of the sea. The sight filled him with a sudden doubt, for he knew too well the meaning of those lines. He had seen them once before in the desert beyond Diaspar, and they told him that his journey had been in vain. "This planet is as dry as earth," he said dully. "Its water is all gone. Those markings are the salt beds where the seas have evaporated." "They would never have let that happen," replied Hilvar. "I think that after all, we are too late." His disappointment was so bitter that Alvin did not trust himself to speak again, but stared silently at the great world ahead. With impressive slowness, the planet turned beneath the ship, and its surface rose majestically to meet them. Now they could see buildings, minute white incrustations everywhere, save on the ocean beds themselves. Once this world had been the center of the universe. Now it was still, the air was empty, and on the ground were none of the scurrying dots that spoke of life. Yet the ship was still sliding purposefully over the frozen sea of stone, a sea which here and there had gathered itself into great waves that challenged the sky. Presently the ship came to rest, as if the robot had at last traced its memories to their source. Below them was a column of snow-white stone springing from the center of an immense marble amphitheater. Alvin waited for a little while. Then, as the machine remained motionless, he directed it to land at the foot of the pillar. Even until now, Alvin had half hoped to find life on this planet. That hope vanished instantly as he left the airlock. Never before in his life, even in the desolation of Shalmarain, had he been in utter silence. On Earth, there was always the murmur of voices, the stir of living creatures, or the sighing of the wind. Here were none of these, nor ever would be again. "Why did you bring us to this spot?" asked Alvin. He felt little interest in the answer, but the momentum of his quest still carried him on even when he had lost all heart to pursue it further. "The Master left from here," replied the robot. "I thought that would be the explanation," said Hilvar. "Don't you see the irony of all this? He fled from this world in disgrace. Now look at the memorial they built him." The great column of stone was perhaps 100 times the height of a man, and was set in a circle of metal slightly raised above the level of the plain. It was featureless and bore no inscription. For how many thousands or millions of years, wondered Alvin, had the Master's disciples gathered here to do him honor? And had they ever known that he died in exile on distant Earth? It made no difference now. The master and his disciples alike were buried in oblivion. "Come outside," urged Hilvar, trying to jolt Alvin out of his mood of depression. "We've traveled halfway across the universe to see this place. At least you can make the effort to step out of doors." Despite himself, Alvin smiled and followed Hilvar through the airlock. Once outside, his spirits began to revive a little. Even if this world was dead, it must contain much of interest, much that would help him to solve some of the mysteries of the past. And we will explore that past and this newly found world next time.